Welcome to the Common Toad podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of having Mark Vernon on. He is a psychotherapist. He's a student of theology, of physics. He has a PhD in ancient philosophy. He's the writer of many books and many articles on the topics of kind of mind and soul, incorporating spirituality, literature, psychology, all the sorts of things that I'm interested in talking about here. He's written for Aeon Magazine, The Idler, Church Times, Tablet. He's been on BBC Radio, and he has a lot to say about some of the topics that I've talked about with some other people over the last year or so. What I wanted to talk to Mark about first today, or what I want as a kind of the guiding light of this conversation to be, is a book that he just wrote. Came out a couple months ago, and I'll hold it up here. This is Dante's Divine Comedy. It's a guide to Dante, which is a kind of a harrowing task, Mark. So I want to just say, first, thank you. Welcome to the podcast. And maybe we can just start out by, if you can briefly describe your motivations for writing. First of all, a piece which made me, which kind of introduced you to me, that you wrote for Aeon Magazine about Dante over the summer, which was I found it to be like one of the real clear, I don't want to say straightforward, but very clear, thoughtful explanations of a medieval work. And so maybe just talk about first how you came to write that article and this book that you've been working on as a project, in terms of your motivations and your relationship to Dante.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for having me on. I love talking about these things, so I hope that our conversation will be inspiring to others. I first really managed to get into Dante, to find a way in, actually during my own psychotherapy. I work as a psychotherapist, and that involves your own therapy. And I had quite traditional analysis, and it was being part of a reading group, reading the Divine Comedy during that process, which is one of descent, and then, with luck, turn around, that it started to really open up to me. And then I've read it sort of every year since. And just last year, so at the beginning of the lockdown period, just before actually, I decided to read it again, but this time do a series of podcasts. And then that became a kind of spiritual discipline through the lockdown, doing one podcast for each of the 100 cantos of the Divine Comedy. And, that was a really wonderful process, because it means you don't just read it, you don't just wrestle with it and try and make some sense of it, but then try and come up with something to say about it as well. And so it was a really good process for me. And then someone suggested that surely there's a book in this. This year, 2021, is the 700th anniversary of the Divine Comedy, of Dante's death. So It makes sense to produce something about the Divine Comedy. And the thing I was really interested in was how it is a spiritual transformation. It's not just a work of history, it's not just a work of theology, not just a work of poetry, but Dante is really clear time and again that he wants to convey his transformation of perception. So he doesn't just see hellish worlds, but learns to see paradise. He wants to transmit that in a way that it can awaken in us too. And so my book is very much focused on that, understanding what's going on for Dante and others in every particular moment, in order to facilitate something growing in us too. And my sense is actually it's quite hard to find a book that treats the Divine Comedy in that way, that helps you find a way into the labyrinth so that it can start opening up for you too. Yeah, so it came, via long time reading, through podcast, into a book.
Well, I kind of had the sense too that you said that there wasn't a real kind of guide, the likes which that you created, because I'm reading, this is my version, it's a Mendelbaum translation, and like most, there's a bunch of notes, very useful, because Dante, if people haven't read any, will, as soon as they start reading, they'll realize so much of what he talks about is kind of local to his time and place, and a lot of references to even people who are a little bit familiar with ancient myth. It's just a barrage of images and figures and stuff. So it's great to have these notes, in the text, which usually, isn't, most translations have some kind of an index for it. But yeah, what really is needed for people who are interested is a kind of guide by a modern person. I think, I think one of the problems with people approaching something like this, an old great work of literature like this, is they kind of become intimidated with it. They kind of have doubts about whether or not it has any resonance to them personally or to their era. And you do a nice job of showing, kind of lifting the veil a little bit and saying that there's layers of intention here with Dante. It's not just him talking about some, gripes that I've heard it described as, just a list of grievances against people and his political enemies and stuff. But you kind of take it further down and say that there's multiple layers that you can go into. Maybe a good way to start is just to talk about the most popular of the three, for better or worse. A lot of people, I know, has commented, read the Inferno, and they stop there. They kind of think it's just one, self-contained piece, which is kind of unfortunate, because it really is just 1/3 of a big vision. So in Dante's world, and I suppose by extension in ours, what is hell? What does he mean by hell? And why are the people in this book there? How did they get there? Why is this divine punishment, or is it a kind of self-punishment? Could you just talk a little bit about the figures that find themselves there, and why they are actually there?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that Dante is a late medieval figure, but he explicitly writes for our times. He's the first Italian to use the word modern, for example, and he's very clear he's writing for the future, not for the past. He's writing in the beginning of what is now called the First Industrial Revolution, when banking in its modern forms gets going, when mercantilism starts to develop into what becomes capitalism in time. So he writes in a time of great change that gives birth through the Renaissance to our own times. And I think that he also writes trying to sort of begin where we might be at, but in order to take us somewhere very, very different. And so one of the ways of understanding why he goes on this journey through the Inferno first is because it connects with what many people did and still do think about God, that God is this divine judge who hates anything impure, loathes sin, needs to protect himself against all odds from anything that might be construed as evil, and does that by throwing people into eternal torment. But immediately Dante starts to question that. I mean, even the gates of hell, which have the famous words, "Abandon hope, all you who enter," written above them. It turns out that they also talk about how hell was made by love and by justice. And so immediately you start to think, wait a minute, if he's beginning with Inferno 101, where's he really taking me? And right the way through the Inferno, you meet things, or conversely don't see things that you would have expected to meet. And I think a way of summarizing it is this idea of the contrapasso, which you alluded to, the sort of punishment fits the crime kind of idea. But even that is too swift a summary, because the word contrapasso is actually only used once in the whole of the Inferno by Dante himself, and it's used in the value of the schismatics, who are kind of fundamentalists, that because they adhere too closely to the rule of the law and forget the spirit, ruin everything that they touch. And so the word contrapasso needs to be handled with very great care as well. And much more, I think what's revealed to Dante is that these are people who are trapped because they can't see that life might be about anything else. And in the early stages, the upper rings of hell, circles of hell, this is sort of desires that have misfired, that have kind of collapsed in on themselves. So one of the famous encounters is with Francesca da Rimini and her lover Paolo. And if you like, Francesca's in love with being in love, and doesn't see that it can lead anywhere else. And so she gets trapped in a kind of romantic whirlpool, and doesn't go anywhere. It gets darker further down they go. So there are figures who are trapped by the need to revenge what they feel has been done against them. Or, I mean, particularly for our times, the figures who have been sucked into the status of usury, making money out of money for its own sake. And so doing nothing really creative, but just replicating forms on Earth, which of course
not a great sign for our age.
No, I mean, it's really, it is quite chilling. Yeah, you wonder why there's so much depression in the midst of so much material goods, and how usury actually can so easily collapse us in on the pursuit of money for money's sake, and so uncouple us from meaning and wider life plays out. And then finally, when they get to the floor of hell, one of the great revelations of the Divine Comedy is that Lucifer is actually trapped in infernal ice, stuck, barely able to move, almost falling out of existence altogether. And so that really is the message of these hellish states. It's when we get stuck in what Freud would later call repetition compulsions, and life just falls in on itself. That really is the message of the Inferno. There's no possibility of change because of the states of mind. Everyone's preoccupied with the past or obsessed with the future, and no one's actually living in the present in the Inferno. And that's so important because the present is where change happens. It's where new worlds open up.
And that's a key thing, I think, to one way of understanding Inferno is to think of it not so much as some kind of authority imposing its punishment upon you, but you constantly see people who in the Inferno who are just kind of lost. They're kind of self-imposed in their punishments. They haven't yet developed a sense of self-awareness. Almost the Paolo and Francesca example is a good one. I think, like in our very literal modern age, I think people, I mean, remember in high school people reading that and being like, you have to be flying around, they didn't do anything that bad, why are they getting punished, being tossed around by the wind and everything. But it's not so much of a punishment if you can think about just in terms of what their minds are doing and what they haven't been able to conquer from inside out, basically.
Yeah, I mean, love is like that. Any romantic film or comedy will be about how it tosses you round and about.
Yeah.
And moreover, the minute the romance is over, like when the couple get married, the film's over. We're just not interested in where love might lead after that moment. And so that is Dante anticipating our now very much.
Now, there's a very strange and telling moment in Canto 9 of the Inferno, which I really enjoyed, which is when Virgil, who is Dante's guide and is someone who he greatly admires in life as a poet, he is seen up until that point as this authority figure for Dante. He's the one thing that he can trust, right? But even Dante suddenly comes to they call the gates of Dis. Is it the gates of Dis? Is that how you pronounce it? And he starts doing some negotiating and with demons and things, and he can't get in. He can't get in. And there's this moment of collapse where Dante and Virgil both are feeling like they don't know what to do next. And there's this amazing point where all of a sudden they see across the river Styx some emissary of heaven just easily walking up to the gates, unlocking it, and almost without even a look again, shuttling back up to whatever more important things that it was doing. And that was that moment, just kind of where you start to think, okay, things aren't necessarily the way that they seem here. We can't take this work literally, Could you just talk a little bit about that, about just little cracks in the pavement of this story, which kind of allude to something deeper?
Yeah, it's a wonderful moment. And the gates of Dis is another word for Lucifer or Satan. So it's where hell gets really serious. So Francesca and Paolo are in sort of a higher circle, but when they enter real darkness, actually, not just misfiring or ignorant desire, it's through the gates of Dis. And the story is that Virgil has made this descent before. This also becomes clear to Dante in Canto 9. And Virgil says that he was asked to make the descent before by a necromancer. And so that's partly why he's confident at the start, because he's traveled this path before. But presumably before, when he reached the gates of Dis and had to negotiate with the demons who are on its battlements, they recognized that Virgil was on their side because he was working for a necromancer, doing sort of foul things, if you like, and so let him in. But this time when Virgil goes up to the gates, the demons don't open the door because they also see Dante, and they've recognized that Dante's alive, he's not dead, and that this must therefore be a sign of the divine presence in Dante's journey. And Virgil's at a loss, but he knows enough to know that this angel's going to come across the Styx, and so isn't completely devastated in the way that Dante is. And sure enough, the angel comes, as you say, very easily, sort of mocks the demons, the doors open, and then disappears as fast as it arrived. And I think what this is all about is, are the gates of Dis shut to keep demons in, or to keep Dante and Virgil out? And I think this is what what Dante doesn't, and Virgil doesn't realize actually, is that they could have walked straight through. They didn't need the demons' permission. The demons, it's partly a ruse to just keep you uncertain and terrified and unclear what's going on. But the gates of hell, and this is shown a lot in iconography from the Eastern Orthodox Church, can be opened from the outside, in fact. And that's what Christ does in the harrowing of hell. And it's we ourselves, as it were, who lock our own gates from within, that trap ourselves. That's sort of the psychological message, if you like. There's always the possibility of light getting in fact, because much as we've locked the gates, we can find the way to unlock them too. And I mean, they need the message of the angel to sort of show them that this so. They haven't got the imagination, you might say, to see that it's otherwise than they thought. So it's a big message to us as well as readers to constantly be asking, what's really going on here? What's really going on in my life? And what have I assumed that I might be actually completely missing something crucial? So yeah, it's a wonderful dramatic moment. I mean, it's one of those moments that you could see in many a box set now, with angels appearing and demons glowering and all that. Yeah. But ultimately, it's about our state of mind and how we lock the divine out unwittingly as much as anything else.
All right, so let's think about Purgatory, and first of all, Purgatory in terms of how it compares with Inferno, because one of the interesting things about it as they start to move up this mountain of Purgatory is the reader starts to realize that some of the things that the souls or the shades that are involved in or that are living in Purgatory at the time are actually sort of facing similar punishments in some way to what you find in Inferno, not the real gruesome ones, but there are a lot of similarities, and sometimes it's for the same kinds of things, but the feeling of it is totally different, and the attitude that they have is totally different. So yeah, could you just talk about maybe what those differences are and what that dynamic is between the Inferno and Purgatory?
Yeah, so one of the big differences is that whereas the Inferno is underground, Purgatory is envisaged as a mountain, right. And so it's where days and nights occur. In fact, they spend 3 days and nights on Mount Purgatory, and so that means that there's a present moment. It's not souls who are trapped in obsessions with the past or fears of the future, but they can see the sunrise, they can see the stars in the sky, and so know the time telling is a big part of the Purgatorio. And that means that they can come to themselves. They realize that time is for something, and time is for us to come to ourselves, to realize who we are, and then to realize that we can orientate all of ourselves towards the divine. In a way, this is the canto in which, this is the canticle in which the meaning of life, if you like, really comes out. And in particular, the purging is not getting rid of the things that you don't like. It's seeing through the things that you're mistaken about in order that all of you might become aligned to the divine, and so be ready to enter paradise. So I think that's what it's about. And people do suffer in purgatory, as you say, but their suffering has a meaning. They know that they're working at something, that their being actually is expanding. If you like, the suffering is like the vanguard of their growth. And again, you know, there's a lot of human sense in this, that you know, very often in psychotherapy, a turning point is reached when people aren't overwhelmed by their suffering anymore, but the suffering doesn't automatically cease, but they're able to lean into it almost and realize that by embracing what previously had been difficult, they're actually incorporating parts of themselves that they found too difficult. And so by that incorporation are growing, and are able to stand more upright, if you like, in life, say yes to all things rather than having to say, I want that, I don't want that. And that is so important when it comes to the spiritual vision, because of course everything is in God. This is one of the big things that Dante realizes. It's not that the Inferno, even Lucifer, is outside of God, because if it were, it would just fall out of existence altogether. But if we're therefore to know the divine fully, we must be able to say yes to all of ourselves. And so that's a big part of the task of purgatory.
There's a great part which you note in your book, or just a moment where you compare hoarders and wasters in hell, who are being punished for their, in some sense, opposite sins, versus how people are treating each other in purgatory as they're learning, in some sense, the same lesson. And you say, hoarder, one yelled; waster, the other replied. They exchanged blind accusations. The difference is that on purgatory, when the two types come together, they're able to think about themselves, not merely project their worst onto others. It's a very interesting point too, because it has to do not just with inner development, but the way that we are oriented towards other people, and how much we're willing to treat other people as actual people, as opposed to ideological ideas or something that you have, and kind of use them to either demonize them or worship them. It's something that kind of hits home, I think, even more now, in our era, in this age of social media, where we have just so often these avatars that we shout at and put all of our wrath onto, who are actually real people sitting behind their computers or behind their phones. But we don't seem to have moved beyond the infernal part. we haven't really extended like that grace towards other people yet, and that's just another part where it just seems so contemporary.
Yeah, no, it's much easier just to hurl all your anger or your frustration or hate at others, rather than try and take responsibility for yourself, and then through your own change begin to see more of others, because you're not just using them as a screen to try and really get rid of bits of yourself ultimately.
So one thing about Paradise, then, the final of the three books, is that there's still learning and growth and even mistakes being made in it, in Dante's vision of it. So what does it take to reach paradise, and what really separates it from purgatory?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important, and I'm glad we've got to paradise, because as you said at the beginning, many people think the Inferno is the one where the action's at, and they forget the rest. It feels like a huge comment in our times that we're not interested in paradise. And Dante himself too says that that's really the most difficult book in terms of the greatest expansion of his learning. And so he says again at the beginning of the Paradise that you must follow me very closely and watch what's going on. And I think it's because there's a series of transformations that become possible with kind of paradisal eyes. So for one thing, Dante has understood his own desire, his own intelligence fully. So whilst he can make mistakes, he can never be completely caught out. And in fact, his mistakes become opportunities for learning, because he realizes something's not right in what he's assumed, but can follow it through. And so more is always revealed. You know, that's one difference. He realizes that his love and his wisdom is in the service of his growth. And that growth is going to come continually from the outside in. Again, these heavens of paradise. It's almost like in each moment, something that he'd taken to be the case is either reversed or it's greatly expanded. So you know, it starts off in the heaven of the moon, the first of the spheres that they enter. And here, I think one of the things he learns is that you actually get far further in life if you learn to follow the qualities that things have, rather than always holding to quantities. And of course, you know, we live in a culture that far values quantity over quality. You know, if something can be measured, if it can be proven empirically, if it can be captured in a statistic, and we're much more likely to trust it than an intuition, the imagination, following the energy or the feel of something. You know, there are places that still do this, but broadly speaking, they play second fiddle to the qualitative. When Dante learns in the Sphere of the Moon that it's precisely the opposite. And part of the reason for this is that, again, it makes intuitive sense that, you know, the quality of something is often that which is less well defined. It is harder to know quite what it means or to hold on to it. But by following the quality, you enter a wider world as a result. You know, whereas the quantity has already been pinned down, it's already been fully understood, it's already been put in a box. And so whilst it may make you feel powerful or in control, it's not actually going to lead you anywhere different. It's not going to take you into a world that you don't understand, because making a quantity is precisely to say, I've got it, I understand it. Yeah, and you know, so it's about following the energy. I mean, if you read a poem, you know, there's a part of, you know, me anyway, that kind of immediately wants to go, but what's it about? You know, can I kind of interpret it or decipher it? You know, that is something you can do, but it probably shuts the poem down. And if you can just stay with the feel of the poem or the energy that it imparts, you know, in details or as a whole, then there's a much greater chance that it's going to take you towards something you didn't grasp before, which of course is what poetry can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's a great sketch of the journey itself and its kind of resonance with psychological resonance with us and just with any human throughout any age, probably. Let me pause now with that, and I'd like at this point to just bring into discussion a figure who you've talked extensively about and written about in your book, A Secret History of Christianity, and that's Owen Barfield. So before I want to see if there's a connection between some of his ideas and some of the things that I've been thinking about reading your book and reading Dante. But before we do that, can you just describe, just say who he is? I mean, I'll just say Owen Barfield, if people don't know, is somebody who was a contemporary of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and he was very influential in that group, that circle called the Inklings. Very, very influential on Lewis, somewhat on Tolkien too. And he had some interesting ideas about humanity's development in terms of its coming to itself, understanding itself, and what the next steps are in our development, both on the individual level but also on the species level and maybe the societal level as well. And it's kind of a thing that I don't know if it got much traction at the time, but it feels as though it's relevant now. And I've heard you talk about him and about his idea of original versus what's it called, versus final participation.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So could you just briefly just sketch what that idea is?
Yeah, so like Lewis and Tolkien, Barfield was a philologist, a lover of words. What Barfield realized is that you couldn't just conjure different worlds with different words, like particularly Tolkien was so good at, but that if you used words and understood how they change their meaning across time, they could become fossils of human consciousness, not just the wonderful magic of fantasy. And so Barfield did this, and this led him to realize that words have changed meaning substantially over time, but in a discernible pattern, in a particular way, which he then used to come up with an idea of how human consciousness has evolved or changed over time, by which he means it's the sense of what it is to be human and to relate to others and to the natural world and to the gods has changed. And his idea was that originally, and by this he means about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, because that's the extent to which substantial written works survive. I mean, the invention of writing is itself part of the change of consciousness, so that's the reason for that. But originally, so say in the time of Homer, or say in time of the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible, the oldest traditions in India, the Vedic texts and so on, that he saw that people experienced life and meaning from the outside in, is a way of putting it. So the world was alive, the cosmos was full of vitalities, and the effort of myth and the effort of ritual was to organize that great maelstrom of activity from the outside in order to secure your place in that great flood of meaning. And then this starts to shift. I mean, maybe it starts to shift as people use writing for different reasons, notably for writing down the myths. And if you think about it, that changes the way that you relate to them, because if in an oral culture, it's about being in the right place at the right time with the right group around you. You've probably performed some rituals to get you in the right mood. Mm-hmm. And then the myth, as it were, appears before you from the outside in. When you read, this is you and the text, and the meaning has to spring from within you. The words themselves, are sort of neutral on the page, but they can catalyze meaning in you. And so writing along with other things starts to create this sense that no, meaning comes from the inside out. And that creates a sense of being an individual much more powerfully. Which he saw particularly in the significance of Christianity, that Christianity has this idea that there was one person who had become so fully human that they could see with complete transparency the one God, the I am of Jesus, if you like, perfectly reflected the I am of the divine. And so monotheism is born at about the same time as well. And so he sees this participation with life greatly shifting. But he has this extra twist that it always shifts through periods of alienation and loss and concern, anxiety. And because when the old way of understanding starts to fall apart, it creates a crisis. But that can then foster a catalyst or catalyze a new sense of participation. And he thought that we were in a similar time now, and this greatly inspired the Inklings. And so Lewis and Tolkien's efforts were directly, both Lewis and Tolkien said this, were inspired by Barfield's analysis.
So to me, it seems as though this description of humanity's development and the development that in theory is to come, it has some resonance with Dante's vision, like in that the journey upward from hell to purgatory to paradise entails a kind of awakening into self-awareness of one's situation and a desire to participate in one's development. like we were said before, some of the punishments of hell are actually similar to those in purgatory, but it's less of a sense of these things are happening to me as opposed to I am a participant in this, in creating something else out of this suffering or difficulty. I mean, do you think Barfield and Dante are talking about similar things, or do you think they're different in that sense?
No, I'm sure they are. I mean, we know that Barfield read Dante because actually Lewis tells us that Barfield and him read the Divine Comedy once a year.
Oh yeah, right.
And it's been pretty conclusively shown now, I think, that aside from explicit books by Lewis that draw on the Divine Comedy, like The Great Divorce, the Narnia Tales, the 7 books of the Narnia Tales correspond to the 7 planetary spheres in the paradise too. I mean, that's kind of a long story, but Michael Wood has shown this, I think, to the vast majority of people's satisfaction now. Now, Barfield himself didn't write so much about Dante, but I think you can see a lot of Barfield's analysis in Dante. And as you say, it's not just that it's the one individual going on this great cosmic journey and being transformed in the process to a new kind of participation, but also that it's just a regular guy doing this trip. He's not a priest,
Right.
He's not a pope. He, moreover, is writing in the vernacular, in Italian rather than Latin, which would have been quite shocking at the time. He's using poetry to write a kind of new scripture, so receiving a new revelation as well. So there's a huge sense of a new dispensation opening up in Dante, and so a pull from the future to a different kind of participation. So it very much corresponds to Barfield's sense of things.
Yeah, there's an issue of free will that comes up here, I think, in where both Dante and maybe Barfield kind of can meet. There's a part in Purgatory where they're ascending the mountain and they find themselves in this thick smoke, which is supposed to be, and Dante can't see at all, and it's a representative of a kind of blind rage or something, and it has the effect of cutting a person off from the world. And you have a line in your book where you ask a couple questions. You say, how free are we when the significance of these environmental factors is factored in? Can we be held to account and blamed for our flaws? And if we're not responsible, how can we participate in our change? And this is something that has, this question of whether or not we have free will is a particularly tricky question for us now in this era where, in addition to just feelings of helplessness that you might feel on your day-to-day life, there's also, intellectual disciplines where, like modern determinism, where people kind of have the sense that there's this question of whether or not if we're participants in life and in creation, or whether we just ride around in this vehicle called our bodies or our heads, and it's just our experience is just epiphenomenal. It doesn't have any effect on anything. It's just something that happens to us because everything that we do is predetermined by everything that happened before it in a kind of closed physical system with ironclad laws. It's a difficult, people have a lot of trouble with this. I mean, this is not like every person who's a materialist thinks this. There's a variety of opinion, but it is something that seems to pervade the culture, this feeling of kind of things being out of their hands, their participation not really being real, being some kind of, ephemeral thing. Are there ways that we can use the poetry of Dante or some Barfield's ideas that can kind of help us climb out of this idea and feel like we do actually have, not just theoretically, but really, like, how do we actually have the feeling that we can participate in the world and create and actually make choices that mean something?
I think so, and the passages you described, they occur quite close to the center of the Divine Comedy. I'm at the halfway mark of the 100 cantos, and right. So Dante's put it there because it's kind of a pivotal issue. If you can't resolve the issue of free will, if there's no such thing, then this idea of the individual going on a great journey doesn't make much sense. And I think that one way of putting it is that Virgil and Dante in their discussion, they realized that if you understand will aright, you realize you have it. And the mistake, which is a very common assumption nowadays, is that my will is free to be asserted regardless of any kind of constraints or limitation.
Yeah.
So I should be able to freely express whatever I think. I should be able to freely choose whatever I want. This is the kind of ideal when we're talking about free will nowadays. And Dante realizes that this is a very poor kind of will, because it doesn't seek to connect particularly. It doesn't seek to explore or understand. It just seeks to sort of give off and to assert its own power, and chart its own way through life, and that is bound to lead to, well, psychologically, to alienation, because its primary purpose is not about connecting with the wider life, but also to these more philosophical conundrums, because of course we don't live in vacuums where we can just conjure up whatever we want, and we do live in a world that is shaped by all sorts of forces upon us, whether they be genetic or whether they be due to the environment, our times, our place, and so on. But there's another kind of will, which is the freedom always at any point to align or choose that which is good, as opposed to that which is for ill. And that can be in such small ways that we hardly notice, in the way that we choose to respond to somebody, or bigger ways in terms of the way that we organize our lives within the constraints of our lives. And there, Dante realizes we have the freedom to rediscover the good, and so align with all that's best in life, and so find the fullest life, actualize all our potential. So when you see the will as about aligning with what's good around you, you get carried more and more into what's good, and so therefore most free and most fulfilling, and richest, and so on. It's when you think that will is your own kind of isolated capacity, that things start to come unstuck, both in terms of the psychology and the philosophy.
I like that. That's a very interesting answer, because that's kind of what the first version of free will that you're talking about, that we sometimes fetishize or whatever, is thought of to be like a libertarian sense of free will, right? That's quite different than the other that you described, actually trying to determine what the good is and aligning yourself with the good. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So I wanted to ask one other thing about Barfield in the study. So as you said, he studied the evolution of words in society and in writing, as kind of windows into past states of mind. And it seems as though people from past ages kind of inhabited different rooms in the human mind, which I assume are still technically available to us, because our brains are biologically not changed in several thousand years, but which our culture seems to not be aware of them, and so we maybe don't get into certain mind spaces that are available to us. So are there rooms in our mind, do you think, which are not being tended to by materialism and by the age that we're in? And what is the relationship of our kind of material age to reality, if we think of reality as our immediate phenomenological experience?
I mean, yeah, I'm sure that there's whole swathes of existence that have become almost inaccessible to us because of this huge emphasis upon the material, upon the measurable, upon the qualitative, upon reason understood as something that's got to be self-consistent within itself, a sort of logic, rather than reason that's trying to tune in and harmonize with the intelligence round and about us. But you can't put reality down, really. I mean, here's one way of putting it. If you the minute you start to investigate the nature of science, for example, you start to realize that imagination and intuition and qualities like beauty play a huge part in it, and that the scientist is going on a voyage of discovery. it's only in a strange sort of reduced sense that science is presented as this kind of arbiter of truth that can decide above and over anything else. I mean, if you watch any science program on the telly, even, you might notice is that this sort of strange split occurs, that the scientists will probably pop up and say, you know, the universe is a mechanism and we've worked out the laws, and it's unfolding from t=0 to t= God knows what, and we can predict every step of the way, more or less, a sort of mechanistic cosmos. But even as they're talking about that, they will be speaking from the top of a gorgeous mountain with a kind of sunset in the background and great music kind of swelling, you know, almost bringing us to tears. And then there'll be a beautiful shot from the Hubble Space Telescope and so on with wonderful colors. It's qualities that are really speaking to us in those programs. And I think the scientist kind of knows it, because it's their love of the world that propels them through the science. Now, sure, you know, a law will pop up, it'll be tested, it might last for 20, 30 years, and then it'll be overturned by another law, and it'll pop up and, you know, be tested, and then another law. And so the models that science comes up with constantly change. You know, that's part of the interest of science. When I did my physics over 30 years ago now, and things like, I don't know, quantum entanglement, or things like M theory, or people presume the Big Bang was the main story in town, which they don't anymore. Things change really quite fast, even across the course of one lifetime. But, you know, the draw of beauty, love of the imagination, the quest to understand these things, that doesn't change. And so, yeah, I think that you can, although it's easy to feel that the world is hopelessly mechanical, and, you know, to genuinely worry when that is operationalized and so can feel like it traps us, you only have to, as it were, look at the sun, which is a very Dante way of putting it, and appreciate that its warmth is not just a measure of, you know, the kind of energy coming off of the sun, but is drawing you in a heartfelt way, and start to pay attention to life like that. And immediately you can step into other worlds.
Yeah, that makes sense. It is almost a kind of just looking up from what you were looking at, and taking in the world around you, as opposed to trying to come up with some theory to prove that there's more than you know, material substance or something like that. It's the experience itself, I guess. Okay, so before we end, I have just I have a section of questions under the heading, how do we get out of our cultural pit, which is you know, just something that I suppose every age has that question. There's certain calamities and problems that are developing in every age. For us, there seems to be a problem of not being able to agree on values, and not having a sense of meaning. People talk about the meaning crisis all the time, and what to do about it. In Dante, there's definitely a hierarchy of values, right? I mean, it somewhat cuts across our tendency to question all authority, or to deconstruct or prize the purely rebellious spirit, because it's written in this context of there being a God and a set of morals and virtues that you have to follow. So to what extent is our sense of this, our tendency to deconstruct, how is this reconcilable with a hierarchy of values? Is there paradise to be had for us, in a sense? Like, is there a structure that we in a postmodern age can agree on, that we can climb, or we just can't climb anything?
Well, look, I mean, you're right, it's a big question, but one of the ways into it is just think about this word hierarchy, because for us now it tends to mean a structure of power that wants to keep everyone in their place, and that place is beneath the people who are at the top of the hierarchy. Whereas certainly in Dante's spiritual world, the hierarchy is actually seen as the cascade of angels coming down from the divine to spread the light. It's much more like the sun radiating upon the earth. And you know, I'm not just being fanciful about that. The word hierarchy was actually coined by Dionysius the Areopagite, who, apart from other things, wrote about the angels, and said that there's this hierarchy, which is an overflowing, an emanation, a cascading, a showering of light and life. It's only subsequently that it got inverted and then becomes a question of power, not a question of generosity.
Mm.
So, there's a different kind of hierarchy, and then that changes how you understand things like morality. I think this has become really unstuck in our culture, where morality just routinely demoralizes and is kind of weaponized and hurled against opponents. Whereas I think Dante and everyone actually really before the modern period wouldn't have really understood morality quite like that. They would have understood it primarily as about tuning into the world around you. So they would have thought more in terms of virtues, I think, which are these kind of qualities or habits, characteristics that we can develop in ourselves. And they're valuable, not so much because they change our behavior, although they will change our behavior, but because they enable us to see more of life. If you can say yes to life, that is in a way to be more humble, but it's not to be humiliated. It's so that more of life can flow into you, so you can be more open to life. You don't get in your own way. And so this virtuous understanding of things is ultimately expansive. And the cosmos itself was seen to exhibit these virtues, like being full of goodness and truth and beauty. And so as we ourselves try and become more and more capable of experiencing such things, someone might say, oh, you become more virtuous, but the point is really that you can participate in more and more of life. And so I think that, we've got to readdress a lot of what we think about how we should live, and come out of this sense that the cosmos is dead around and about, but that we've come out of this living world, and that's why we're living. We've come out of this world full of intelligence, and that's why, we have intelligence. And then, addressing things like how we experience time. We talked about time earlier on, is really important too. So, clock time has hugely come to dominate the modern world, and that's because it quantifies everything, and so greatly improves the efficiency of the world in terms of material production. And there's a good side to that. We were able to liaise on different sides of the Atlantic because of that just now.
That's right.
Yeah. So, it's got to be in the service of life, not ruling life. And so other kinds of time, which again, we all know about the minute you start to think about it. One that's quite popular and well known in spiritual circles is the Kairos kind of time, which is seeing time as every moment for something new. It's the present that can help us step into a different moment rather than just keep us on the kind of treadmill of life. And so it is about seeing the beauty in something even quite small, or it's about commemorating a moment in the year, like Christmas and the New Year or whenever it might be. It's about experiencing life with a kind of vertical dimension, not just a steady progress into tomorrow. That, there's radical newness, things can break through. And so becoming attuned to that, and not just dismissing them or not even seeing them, is another way in which I think that we can sort of break out of these ways that the modern dominant modes of experiencing life tend to imprison us.
So, and you're a psychotherapist, right? So you talk to people all the time who are dealing with their certain issues and trying to understand life and themselves. And do you have a sense that the crisis of meaning is a real thing now, that it's different than maybe it was a few decades ago, or maybe a century ago, or maybe a little, is it just better documented now? Or do you think that we really are, like right now, kind of going through this big upheaval, which is leaving people feel a lot more alienated than they were? Do you have a sense of it?
I think it's getting worse. You can argue the toss, and it can become a big empirical battlefield. In a way, that's one question, but it's undoubtedly the case that people feel alienated now, and plenty of people do. I think it's the big pandemic that's become endemic in our culture, and mental health and so on is more and more talked about. But even then, it's often talked about in terms of getting back to material life, so you can function well in work, and you can sort of look after yourself in terms of providing for yourself, and there's value in that. I'm not being completely dismissive of that, but what there's less talk about is how maybe our ways of life are part of our mental dysfunction. And that, you know, when someone becomes depressed about the modern world, maybe there's good reason.
Maybe there's a reason.
The modern world is depressing, because it's cut off so much of life, and that this is a secret cry from the soul to know more again. And so I hope that increasingly we'll see mental health being addressed not just as the valiant individual heroically, courageously finding a way through their vulnerability, valuable though that is, but that we'll start to see that our way of living might be called into question too, and that can start to expand once more.
Definitely there's people are, in terms of their beliefs and what they're willing to believe, and in terms of spiritual journeying or exploration, people are kind of in motion. There's a lot of, you know, in America, certainly people dropping out of some forms of Christianity, which are very kind of insular and tight and rule oriented. But at the same time, people are moving into getting interested in other forms of not just Christianity, but also other spiritual things. And I'm thinking, just from the perspective of an American who's just has it, you know, born with this sense of individuality that we have, and that we're meant to kind of embody all the time. There's the question of spiritual oneness, and like the direction of where you head on the spiritual journey. Which one aspect of spirituality that has always kind of been a turnoff for me, and I think other people too, is like the obliterating vision of something, which we sometimes see across lots of different traditions. This idea of oneness in a certain sense, like obliteration of the particular or the novel or of the self entirely. Or more specifically, the individual joys and people we experience as conscious beings. Is there a vision of oneness which does not totally obliterate the particular, the color and the individual joys of life? Or am I on a spiritual journey and I'm just going to have to eventually get over it and become joined with be a drop joined into the big ocean or something like that?
There is, and it's called the Divine Comedy by Dante. Because, you know, one of the things that's so striking is that as he rises more and more into the heavens, there's more and more harmony, but it's because the souls that he meets are becoming more and more themselves. And so when he gets to the sphere of Jupiter, he can no longer tell whether someone's saying I or we, but they are definitely saying both things. And so, this is a sense of unity that is a tremendous celebration of diversity, and with, if you like, the infinity of God, the many beams of light coming from the divine are each a soul or an entity or a being, but they all make up the one light. But you're absolutely right, it's very different from, well, certainly from the notion of a singularity where everything kind of just collapses into a uniform unity. That's actually not free or desirable at all, because it is a kind of collapse into a black hole, really. So everything disappears. Not everything is fulfilled and flourishes. But I think that there is a tension in the spiritual traditions as well, which is kind of interesting, which Barfield's ideas might illuminate, because I think it partly comes out because when you read older spiritual texts, there isn't such a keen sense of the importance of the individual as we have now. And so this is a genuine question as to how we can understand our own particular way of reflecting the divine unity in our own individuality, and seeing how that connects to others' expression of the divine uniqueness as well. The Sufis have good metaphors for it. They say that we're like as many fragments of glass, and although we each reflect the light in our particular way, it's all still the same light. Or they'll say it's about recognizing that every face we meet is the face of God. I think another way of doing it is to use musical analogies in terms of harmonies, which of course can include discord and so on as well, but that make the one sound. So there are ways of envisaging it, metaphors to draw on that can be guides that are better than just, some kind of extinguishing or annihilation of the individual. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I welcome that that news. That
I
I
mean,
don't have to be completely
intuitively
annihilated.
but I mean, if you meet a great spiritual adept, you don't just meet some faceless archetype. You meet a particular person,
Right.
and you have a full sense of their particular character, as well as that character channeling a whole lot more besides, and that's the radiance of their presence. So, again, when you actually start to think about it, it makes sense. If you think about, I've got my being here, if you like, you've got your being where you are, but you only have to alter your perception a bit to realize that we're sharing the same being, even though we're speaking from our particular vantage points, because that's why we can talk at all and understand each other at all. We're giving expression to something together here. So again, it's that diversity that makes for the unity, in fact.
Yeah, no, that's a I would say beautiful and encouraging answer. I like that. And I want to finally ask a strange question. What happened to Dante really? How real was this journey? I remember listening. I was listening to other people talk about Dante too as I was reading Malcolm Guite, and I think Jonathan Pageau said it's not a work of fiction because it's mixed so thoroughly with the personal. It's historical. It has to do with his country. It has to do with his love of literature, and then it has to do with myth as well. And all of these things are just mingling in a really extraordinary way. So, I found myself just kind of putting the book down at certain points and thinking, like, what sort of experience actually causes someone to produce a work like this? Like, how, what did he really experience? Do you have any idea from reading it, or from just maybe outside knowledge about how he produced the book? What was his experience that would cause such a strange and interesting work?
I mean, I think he experienced what he writes, but that's not a straightforward thing to say. So I'd certainly be realist about the Divine Comedy. I suspect that he, first of all, had a devastating experience, which was his the destruction of his life in the Florentine civil wars, which happened around 1301.
Yep.
And this led to the last 20 years of his life being in exile. And whilst he did find places to stay for periods of that, it did also mean that he lost everything that he had, that he wasn't amongst his native Italian speakers anymore, because there were lots of dialects around the Italian peninsula at the time, which for a poet is very devastating.
Yeah. And
he didn't see his family for a long, long time as well. So he could only, and then he could only return to Florence on pain of being burnt alive. So, it was born of a crisis, but I think that crisis precipitated him into that which abides regardless of how terrible life gets. And so that was some kind of spiritual experience, a realization, maybe even a kind of peak ecstatic experience at some point. But the genius of Dante was that he didn't just think, oh, great, I've had a consoling peak experience, I'll try and hold on to it. Like some kind of psychedelic trip that you then risk wanting to do again and again and again and again. He thought, no, this is actually a key to re-envisage the whole of my life. And so the poem is his re-envisaging of the whole of his life and seeing it in its true colors. And, the only way you can really do that is to live it, which is why it has this direct quality that, again, Dante completely underlines. He says many, many times, look, reader, I'm not making this up. This is what I saw. And I think we should really take him seriously at that. But he realized that there's a deeper sight than just literal sight, which is why his exile that had been this terrible trauma could become this experience of revelation. And then, of course, what's even more brilliant with Dante is that he then writes not just for himself kind of trying to add his life up, but in such a way that we can embark on the same process ourselves too. And that's ultimately why I think I'm realist about what Dante's writing, is because it makes a difference to you and I. It's not just like a fantasy in a box set. It really invites you to follow, and not just to replicate. That would not be a paradisal way of doing things. That would be a hellish way of doing things.
Right.
But to see the light in your own life and how it connects with the myriad lights round and about as well.
I think that's a beautiful note on which to end. Before we do go, I just wanted to ask you if you'd like to say if you have any future projects. I know that you or things that you're currently working on. People are interested. You have a very lively YouTube channel too, which I'll link to, and some of the things that we talked about today I'll link to on the webpage that I put up. But you kind of inhabit an interesting spot, in this kind of discussion of spiritual matters, poetic things, because you have a relationship with religion. Yeah, I forgot to mention you were at one point ordained a priest in the Church of England. Is that right?
Yeah, so I did that. It was a while ago now, and I left. I found it too constraining, and I had a sort of breakdown as well. So it's not just the church's fault. But yeah, no, I did leave. Yeah.
So you kind of know your way around traditional forms of religion. That's kind of part of the culture that you grew up in. You have a sense of a lot of like other cultures, traditions, and it's just interesting, always interesting me, the things that people choose to write about and focus on, and I found your choices be quite interesting and illuminating. I'm just wondering what you're working on now, if it's part of a bigger vision, a bigger project, or not.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. Yeah, but I'm putting out, quite a lot on YouTube and other forms of media, partly because it helps one develop your own voice, so that's part of the effort. But also, well, next year, for example, I'll have another book coming out, which is called Spiritual Intelligence in 7 Steps. And basically, this is looking at 7 facets of life, like the big story we tell about ourselves: freedom, death, time, virtue, that kind of thing. And trying to show how all these things can be experienced, not just understood, but can be experienced in dramatically different ways when viewed with this thing that I'm calling spiritual intelligence, which in part is to contrast it with artificial intelligence. I'm involved in a project looking at the impact of artificial intelligence, which is a sort of research project with academics mostly. But our idea is that, artificial intelligence already very present, going to become more present. Personally, I don't think it's about to become conscious, so I don't think that's the fear. But it certainly is at risk of obscuring other kinds of intelligence that we humans have. And so the idea is that we might have a thing called spiritual intelligence. And so if you can identify what that is more, and then show how it affects our experience of life, then as artificial intelligence continues to develop, we can still keep clear sight of a spiritual intelligence that keeps us human. And so lessens our fears, in fact, of AI, because we realize it hasn't got most and the best part of life. It's actually got a rather narrow, valuable, but nonetheless limited hold on us when we know ourselves much more fully.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's a topic for another time, I guess, a big topic, and one that people are certainly preoccupied with. Very good. Okay, so I'll link to some of those things too when I post this video. But I just want to, we packed, I think, quite a bit into a little over an hour, a lot of information, and I hope people who watch this, if they're interested, will go on to look at your work, and definitely recommend your book. It's the first book of yours that I've read. I'm intend on reading more. But I want to thank you so much, Mark, for taking the time to talk with me and to come on the program. And I wish you well in your future writings, and look forward to reading them in the future.
Yeah, well, look, thank you too. And the fact that you're putting on these conversations, and other people are, and that there's growing space where people can explore these things, is a great sign of hope too. a yearning that we can know more of life, but actually the means to begin to do so as well. So thank you very much.
All right. Until next time, take care.